I stepped outside just after sunrise, still expecting a quiet morning, and stopped dead the second I saw the machines. Excavators were already chewing through the edge of my land, metal teeth tearing into soil like it didn't belong to anyone. A trench deep, sharp, and already half-finished cut straight along what was supposed to be my boundary line, and water was rushing through it in a controlled stream, fast and deliberate, like someone had engineered every inch of it. For a second, I thought I was looking at the wrong property. Then I saw him. Daniel Brooks stood off to the side, perfectly calm, a clipboard tucked under his arm, watching the whole thing like it was just another scheduled job. I yelled for them to shut it down, my voice cutting through the noise of engines, but nobody even slowed. Daniel barely turned his head. "It's within my rights," he said, like he'd rehearsed it, then gave a small hand signal for the crew to keep going. That's when it hit me. The trench wasn't riding the boundary. It had crossed it. By several feet. And the water wasn't draining away from me, it was being pushed directly onto my land. This wasn't an accident. It was precise. Intentional. By the time I got a surveyor out there, the system was already finished, and when the measurements came back, there was no doubt left. Every line, every cut, every section of that drainage channel sat inside my property. Not slightly off. Not a mistake. Entirely on my land. On purpose. And standing there, watching that water carve into my ground, I realized something cold and heavy settle in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fence Line File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I didn't come here looking for trouble. After years of grinding through high-stress construction contracts, tight deadlines, constant noise, people yelling over problems that should have been solved weeks earlier, I wanted something simple. Quiet land. Clear boundaries. A place where I could wake up, step outside, and hear nothing but wind moving through trees instead of machines tearing everything apart. When I first bought the property, that's exactly what it felt like. Open space. Clean lines, no confusion about where my land started and ended. It felt settled, predictable, safe. And for a while, it was. Daniel Brooks was one of the first people I met out there. At first, he seemed like any other neighbor. Polite, calm, the kind of guy who'd nod when you drove past and maybe stop for a short conversation if you were both outside at the same time. He even offered a few small pieces of advice about the area. Things like how the soil handled heavy rain or which parts of the road flooded during storms. Helpful, but never overly friendly. There was always a distance to him, like he was careful about how much he said and when he said it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Some people just keep to themselves. The first sign that something wasn't right didn't come from him directly. It came in the form of a letter. Plain envelope, HOA header at the top. Language that felt overly formal for something that didn't seem like a big deal. It talked about boundary clarification and ensuring compliance with community land use standards. I remember reading it twice, trying to figure out what exactly they were asking for, because as far as I knew, there was nothing unclear about my boundaries. Everything had been surveyed and documented when I bought the place. Still, I brushed it off as routine. Maybe they sent those letters to everyone. Then another notice came. This one mentioned drainage compliance. It suggested that certain areas near my property line might require adjustment to align with community standards. That word, standards, stuck with me. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it wasn't neutral either. It carried an expectation, a pressure, like they were setting the stage for something without saying it outright. After that, the tone started to shift. Emails replaced letters, shorter, more direct. Phrases like recommended cooperation and failure to comply may result in further action started appearing more often. Nothing aggressive enough to justify a complaint, but enough to make you pause. Enough to make you feel like you were already behind on something you didn't even know existed. That's when I started talking to the neighbors. Or at least, I tried to. Most of them kept their conversations short, polite, but quick to end things. Eyes drifting away. Bodies turning slightly like they were already halfway out of the interaction. It wasn't hostility. It was avoidance. like they didn't want to be seen saying too much. One afternoon, I caught an older man while he was checking his mailbox. He hesitated when I mentioned the HOA notices, then leaned in just enough to lower his voice. "Don't fight the board," he said quietly. "They always win." He didn't explain what that meant. Didn't give examples. Just straightened up, nodded once, and walked away like the conversation never happened. That was the moment something shifted for me. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was awareness. The kind that sits in the back of your mind and doesn't go away. I started paying closer attention after that. And that's when I began noticing Daniel again, not just as a neighbor, but as someone who always seemed to be present whenever anything related to the HOA came up. He wasn't listed anywhere officially. I checked. No name on the board, no title, nothing that tied him directly to the organization. But he was always there, talking to people, standing just close enough during conversations, watching more than speaking. And when he did speak, people listened. It didn't take long to realize he had influence. Quiet, unofficial influence, but real. Then one morning, I noticed the survey flags. Bright, sharp markers pushed into the ground near my boundary line. Not placed by me, not requested by me, and definitely not authorized by me. They weren't random either. They followed a pattern, a line, precise spacing, like someone had already mapped out exactly where something was going to go. I walked the length of them slowly, trying to make sense of it, but the more I looked, the less it felt like a mistake. It felt planned, deliberate. And as I stood there, staring at those flags cutting across the edge of my land, I felt that same quiet realization settle in again. Stronger this time. Something was already in motion. And whatever it was, I was already in the middle of it. I didn't wait this time. The moment I saw those flags again, lining up like a blueprint I hadn't agreed to, I walked straight over to Daniel. He was already there, like he'd been expecting me, standing just off the edge of the marked line with that same calm posture, clipboard in hand, eyes steady like nothing about this situation was unusual. I didn't bother easing into it. I asked him what exactly he thought he was doing on my land. He didn't hesitate. "It's approved work," he said, simple and flat, like that was supposed to end the conversation. I asked him approved by who. He didn't answer that directly. I asked for permits, documentation, anything official that gave him the right to put markers across my boundary. He looked at me for a second, then just shook his head slightly. "You'll be notified through the proper channels," he said, like I was the one out of line for even asking. Then he turned away, signaling the end of the conversation before I was finished. The next morning, I found the notice taped to my door. HOA letterhead. Formal language. And right there in bold, it accused me of blocking natural drainage flow and failing to comply with established environmental guidelines. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to figure out how they'd twisted reality that far. There was no blockage, no change on my side. Nothing that even came close to what they were claiming. But the notice didn't care about facts. It outlined consequences. Daily penalties if the issue wasn't corrected immediately. Escalating fines. Legal action if I didn't cooperate. It even mentioned possible enforcement measures that could impact property standing. It wasn't a warning. It was pressure. By the end of that day, the fines had already started. They weren't small either. Enough to hurt if they kept stacking, and the language in every follow-up email made it clear this wasn't going to slow down. Immediate compliance required. Failure to act will result in further penalties. Legal escalation pending. Each message was colder than the last, like they were tightening something around me one step at a time. Meanwhile, the work didn't just continue. It accelerated. Machines came in earlier. Stayed later. The trench grew deeper, cleaner, more structured. This wasn't rough digging anymore. This was precision work. Reinforcement frames were lowered into place. Gravel beds were laid. And then I saw the concrete trucks. That's when it really hit me. They weren't testing anything. They were locking it in. I walked straight up to the crew and told them to stop, not ask, told. I made it clear they were inside my property and that they had no authorization to continue. One of the workers glanced at me, then back at his foreman. The foreman stepped forward, calm but firm, like he'd already had this conversation in his head. He said they were cleared to proceed. I asked by who. He didn't hesitate. HOA authority, he said, like that'll erode everything. I told him HOA authority didn't mean anything on private land without legal permits. He didn't argue. Didn't push back, just shrugged slightly and said they were following instructions they'd been given, and if I had a problem, I should take it up with the board. Then he turned away and signaled for the work to continue. And just like that, I was standing there, watching concrete being poured into a structure that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Permanent. Deliberate, not something you undo overnight. That's when the pattern finally became clear. The notices. The fines. The pressure. The timing. They weren't reacting to a problem. They were creating one. They'd already decided this was going to happen. The construction was moving forward no matter what I said, no matter what the actual property lines were. And everything else, the paperwork, the violations, the threats, that was just going to be used afterward to justify what they'd already built. They were building first and planning to make it legal later. The pressure didn't just continue after that, it tightened. Every day brought another notice, another fine, another piece of paper trying to turn me into the problem. The numbers stacked fast, faster than they had any right to, each one tied to the same false claim that I was interfering with natural drainage. The wording got sharper too, less formal, more aggressive, like they were done pretending this was routine. One letter mentioned placing a lien on my property if I didn't resolve the issue immediately. Another warned that continued non-compliance could lead to legal enforcement that would impact ownership standing. It wasn't about fixing anything anymore. It was about forcing me into a corner. At the same time, the neighborhood went quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. People who used to wave stopped looking my direction altogether. Conversations died the moment I stepped closer. Doors closed quicker. Curtains shifted when I walked by. It wasn't just avoidance anymore. It was distance, like they didn't want to be associated with me at all. One afternoon, I tried to talk to a guy who lived 2 houses down, someone I'd had a few decent conversations with before all this started. He barely let me finish before cutting me off. "You're making things worse for everyone," he said, low and tense, like he didn't want anyone else hearing it. Then he walked away before I could respond. That stuck with me longer than it should have, not because of what he said, but because of how sure he sounded. Like whatever was happening wasn't just about me anymore. Then the land itself started changing. At first it was subtle. Patches of ground near the trench stayed damp longer than they should have. Then small pools began forming, shallow at first, then spreading wider with each day. The water didn't just sit there. It moved, slowly carving paths into areas that had always stayed dry before. I walked the edges of it, watching how it shifted, how it collected in specific spots, and it didn't take long to see the pattern. This wasn't random runoff. It was controlled flow. Directed. The trench wasn't just draining something, it was pushing water exactly where someone wanted it to go, onto my land. They were testing it, adjusting angles, watching how it reacted, letting it settle, then changing it again. That realization hit harder than anything else so far. This wasn't just about building something where it didn't belong. It was about using that structure to change the land itself, slowly and deliberately. That's when I decided to stop reacting and start watching. I installed cameras that same night. Not just 1 or 2, but enough to cover every angle of that trench and the areas where the water was spreading. I kept them small, out of sight, positioned where they wouldn't be obvious unless you knew exactly where to look. Then I waited. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, just movement of water. The third night, that's when everything changed. Around 2 in the morning, the cameras picked up headlights cutting through the dark. A truck pulled up without any markings, lights off as soon as it stopped. 2 men stepped out, moving like they'd done this before, no hesitation, no confusion about where to go. And then Daniel stepped out from the driver's side. Not as a neighbor. Not as someone observing. As someone in charge. They moved straight to the trench, carrying tools, making adjustments to sections that had already been finished during the day. One of them shifted a reinforced panel slightly, while the other altered the angle of a channel that directed the water flow. Daniel stood there watching, occasionally pointing, occasionally stepping in closer like he was checking their work. No paperwork. No permits. No oversight. Just quiet, controlled changes in the middle of the night. I watched the footage again and again, making sure I wasn't missing something. But every time, it told the same story. This wasn't maintenance. This wasn't correction. This was planning. Every movement had a purpose. Every adjustment changed how the water behaved the next morning. And every change pushed that water further into my land. Standing there later, replaying those recordings in my head, something finally clicked into place in a way it hadn't before. All the letters, the fines, the pressure, the silence from the neighbors, the speed of the construction, the secrecy at night. None of it was random. None of it was just HOA enforcement. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. Engineered, calculated, and executed piece by piece. And for the first time since this started, I understood exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't HOA compliance. This was engineered land control. That night, after watching the footage one more time, I stopped thinking about how to fight them and started thinking about how to prove what they were doing. I knew I couldn't handle this alone anymore. The next morning, I called in an independent surveyor, someone with no connection to the area, no ties to the HOA, no reason to look the other way. At the same time, I reached out to a land attorney, a guy who specialized in property disputes and didn't scare easily. I didn't sugarcoat anything when I explained the situation. I showed him the footage, the notices, the fines, the survey flags, all of it. He didn't interrupt much, just listened, then said one thing that stuck with me. If this is what it looks like, they've already crossed multiple lines. That was all I needed to hear. The investigation moved fast after that. The surveyor remeasured everything from scratch, not just the boundary lines, but the exact placement of the trench, the angles, the depth, the direction of flow. Meanwhile, my attorney started digging through HOA records, permits, filings, internal documents, anything that might explain how this construction was even happening. At first, it looked like they'd covered their tracks well. No official permits tied directly to my land. No approved construction notices. Nothing that clearly authorized what was already sitting there, cutting into my property like it belonged to someone else. Then we found it. Buried in a stack of internal HOA documents, flagged but never finalized, was a proposal. Detailed, technical, and way too familiar. It outlined a drainage project along the boundary lines of multiple properties, including mine. It included diagrams, flow directions, soil impact assessments, everything. And right there, at the bottom, was the decision. Rejected. The reason was listed clearly: illegal land use, unauthorized impact on private property, risk of liability. I remember staring at that page longer than I should have, reading the same lines over and over again, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Because if the proposal had been rejected, then none of this should have been happening. The trench, the construction, the water flow, none of it should have existed. But it did. Which meant one thing: they didn't stop. They just stopped doing it officially. The more we dug, the clearer it became. There were no permits because they never filed for them again. No approvals because they never asked. Everything that was happening out there had been moved off the record, pushed into that gray space where it looked like authority but didn't actually have it. And at the center of it all, every line, every adjustment, every decision pointed back to the same person. Daniel, not as a neighbor, not even just as someone connected to the HOA, but as the one driving it. Then came the part that changed everything. The surveyor mapped the entire system, every angle, every slope, every redirection point. He overlaid it with the natural water flow patterns of the land, both before and after the trench was built. When he finished, he didn't need to explain much. The design spoke for itself. This wasn't drainage. It was manipulation. The system was engineered to take water that would normally disperse across multiple areas and concentrate it onto my land. Not all at once, that would have been obvious. Instead, it pushed just enough, slowly, over time. Enough to saturate the soil. Enough to weaken the ground. Enough to make parts of the land unusable without it looking like direct damage. I asked him what that would do long term. He didn't hesitate. It lowers the value, he said. Makes it harder to maintain, harder to sell, unless someone nearby benefits from that. That's when everything locked into place. The fines. The pressure. The letters. The false violations. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were setting conditions, creating a situation where my land would become a problem, financially, structurally, legally, until the easiest option left was to give it up. Sell it, walk away from it. And who would be right there to take it? The same person who designed the system in the first place. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even just a conflict. It was a strategy. And it had been planned from the beginning. I sat there for a long time after that, everything running through my head at once. The frustration, the anger, the realization of how far they'd already gone. But underneath all of that, something else started to settle in. Something steadier. Clarity. For the first time since this started, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly what they were doing. And more importantly, I knew I could prove it. That's when I made the decision. I wasn't going to defend myself against this anymore. I was going to expose it. All of it. Once everything clicked into place, I stopped reacting to them and started building something they couldn't ignore. I organized everything first, every piece of proof, every detail they thought no one would connect. The camera footage went into labeled files, timestamps clean and impossible to dispute, showing exactly what happened at night when no one was supposed to be there. The survey reports were cross-checked and certified, every measurement clearly marking where the trench cut into my land and how far it extended beyond any legal boundary. Then came the internal HOA documents, the rejected proposal that proved they knew exactly what they were doing long before the first machine ever touched the ground, and finally, the water flow analysis, the part that tied it all together. It showed how the system redirected water in a controlled pattern, how it built pressure in specific areas, how it slowly shifted the condition of my land in ways that didn't look like damage at first glance, but would become impossible to ignore over time. I didn't rush it. I didn't confront anyone. I just kept building the case piece by piece until there were no gaps left. Then I reached out to the county, not through the usual channels, not through anything that would alert the HOA or give them time to cover things up. I contacted someone directly, explained just enough to get their attention, and offered to show them what I had. It took a day before I got a response. Short, careful, but interested. We met off the record, away from the property, away from anyone who might recognize him. I laid everything out in front of him, footage, documents, reports. He didn't say much while he went through it, but I could see the shift in his expression as the pieces started lining up. By the time he finished, he leaned back slightly and just nodded once. "This doesn't look like compliance," he said quietly. "This looks like a violation." He didn't commit to anything officially, not yet. But he told me he'd take a closer look when the time came. That was enough. I didn't need immediate action. I needed timing. And then, almost like they were helping me without realizing it, the HOA made their move. An official notice went out to the entire community. Emergency meeting. Mandatory attendance. The subject line said everything I needed to see. Land compliance enforcement action. Against me. I read it once, then again, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to calm. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just a steady kind of certainty. Because that meeting wasn't just another attempt to pressure me. It was a stage. A public one. And they were about to step onto it, thinking they were in control. They wanted to make an example out of me. They wanted to frame the narrative in front of everyone. They wanted to finalize whatever they thought they'd already won. What they didn't realize was that they were giving me exactly what I needed, a room full of witnesses. A formal setting. and a moment where everything could be put on record at once. I didn't respond to the notice, didn't argue, didn't push back. I let them believe I was still on the defensive, still trying to keep up with whatever they threw at me next. Meanwhile, I finalized everything on my end. Copies of the evidence, backup files, printed reports. I went over the sequence again and again, making sure every piece led cleanly into the next, that nothing could be dismissed or twisted out of context. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Not because I was unsure, but because I knew what was coming. All the pressure they'd built, all the control they thought they had, all of it was about to shift. I stood outside for a while before going back in, looking at the land that had been quiet when I first bought it, now cut through with something that was never supposed to be there. The water still moved through that trench, steady and controlled, exactly the way it had been designed to. For now. Because by the next day, everything about that system, and the people behind it, was about to be brought into the open. So I gathered everything one last time, set it where it needed to be, and did the only thing left to do. I waited. The day of the HOA meeting arrived with that same heavy stillness that had been hanging over everything for weeks, but this time it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like a countdown. I walked into the community hall early, carrying nothing that looked unusual, nothing that would draw attention, and still every step felt measured. The room was already filling up, neighbors taking seats in small clusters, speaking quietly, glancing toward the front where the board had set themselves up like this was just another routine gathering. But it wasn't. You could feel it in the air. Something about this meeting was different, even if most of them didn't know why yet. The board members sat in a straight line behind a long table, organized, composed, papers stacked neatly in front of them. They looked confident, like everything had already been decided before anyone even walked into the room. And then there was Daniel. He stood slightly off to the side, not officially part of the board, but positioned close enough to be included in every conversation. Same posture, same calm expression. Watching everything without reacting, like he already knew how this was going to end. I took a seat near the middle of the room, not hiding, not making myself obvious either. Just present. Waiting. The meeting started quickly. No small talk, no delay. One of the board members stood up and began outlining the issue, and from the first sentence, it was clear how they were framing it. This wasn't a discussion. It was a presentation, a case, and I was the subject. They described me as non-compliant, a property owner refusing to cooperate with necessary environmental adjustments, someone interfering with community infrastructure. They talked about drainage issues, about risk to surrounding properties, about how my actions or lack of action were affecting everyone else. Every word was polished, structured, designed to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know what was really happening. Then came the documents, printed notices, copies of the violations they'd been sending me, lists of fines that had been building day by day. They laid them out like evidence, like proof that I had been given every opportunity to fix the situation and chose not to. And as they spoke, I could feel the room shifting, heads nodding slightly, people leaning forward, following along. It was working. That was the part that almost impressed me. How clean they made it look, how easy it was to turn the story into something else entirely. Then they escalated it. One of the board members adjusted his papers, cleared his throat, and moved into the next section. His tone changed slightly firmer, more formal. He began outlining the consequences of continued non-compliance. Legal enforcement, financial penalties, and then the line they had been building toward the entire time. Forced legal action. Possible property seizure if the issue remained unresolved. The room went quieter after that. Not silent, but close enough that every word carried. That was the moment they wanted. The moment where pressure turned into fear, where the outcome felt decided. I could feel eyes shift toward me, waiting to see how I'd react. Whether I'd argue, defend myself, try to explain, but I didn't move right away. I let the silence sit for a second longer than it needed to. Then I stood up. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady. For the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting to them. I wasn't trying to keep up or push back in the moment. Everything I needed was already in place. Every piece of their story had already been broken down, matched against what actually happened, and prepared to be shown exactly for what it was. I looked at the board first, then at Daniel. He was watching me closely now, still calm, but more focused, like he was trying to read what I was about to do. And for a brief second, I wondered if he realized it, if he could see that this wasn't going the way he expected anymore. Then I shifted my attention to the room, to everyone who had been listening to their version of the story, and I took a breath, calm, prepared, and completely ready. I didn't raise my voice when I started speaking. I didn't need to. The room was already quiet enough that every word carried. I told them they were right about one thing. There was a problem. Just not the one they thought. Then I reached into my folder and placed the first document on the table in front of the board. The survey report. Clean, certified, impossible to argue with. I walked them through it step by step, showing exactly where the trench crossed the boundary line, how far it extended into my land, how every measurement lined up in a way that left no room for interpretation. A few people in the room leaned forward. Others looked back at the board. No one spoke. Then I moved to the next piece, the video. I didn't rush it. I let it play. Headlights cutting through the dark, unmarked truck. Workers moving in silence. And then Daniel stepping into frame, pointing, directing, adjusting parts of the system that had already been completed during the day. No permits, no authorization. Just quiet changes in the middle of the night. You could feel the shift in the room as people started connecting what they were seeing with what they'd been told. The narrative wasn't holding together anymore. I followed that with the engineering reports. Detailed breakdowns of water flow patterns, before and after the trench. Clear diagrams showing how the system redirected water into my land in a controlled way, how it increased soil saturation over time, how it created long-term damage without looking like direct interference. I explained what it meant in simple terms. This wasn't drainage. It was design. Intentional, calculated, and built to change the condition of my property until it became a liability. By the time I finished, no one on the board was speaking. That's when the door opened. No announcement. No warning. Just the sound of it swinging inward, cutting through the silence that had settled over the room. A man stepped in, followed by another, both carrying official folders, both scanning the room like they already knew exactly what they were there for. The first one introduced himself calmly as a county inspector. No raised voice, no urgency, but the effect was immediate. Every head turned. Every movement in the room stopped. Even Daniel. For the first time since I'd met him, something changed in his expression, not panic, but not control either. The inspector didn't wait for permission. He walked straight to the front, asked a few direct questions, then requested access to the documentation I just presented. I handed it over without hesitation. He flipped through it quickly, then signaled to his colleague. A few quiet exchanges passed between them, too low for the room to hear, but enough to make it clear this wasn't unexpected. Then he looked up. "This will need to be reviewed immediately," he said, his tone steady but firm. The room stayed silent as they stepped outside briefly, making calls, coordinating something we couldn't hear. When they came back in, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had started as an HOA meeting was no longer under the board's control. The inspection began right there. Questions directed at the board, at Daniel, at anyone connected to the project. They asked about permits. There were none. They asked about authorization. No clear answers. They asked about the construction timeline. The responses didn't match the evidence. One by one, everything unraveled. The findings came out clearly, without hesitation. Illegal construction, property violation, environmental manipulation, fraudulent enforcement under HOA authority. Each word landed heavier than the last. I didn't need to say anything anymore. The room had already seen it, heard it, understood it. I glanced over at Daniel again. That calm confidence he carried from the beginning was gone. replaced by something tighter, more controlled, like he was trying to hold on to a situation that had already slipped out of his hands. He didn't argue, didn't interrupt, just stood there, silent, as everything he'd built was laid out in front of everyone. Then the next step came. Authorities were contacted. Officially. Not quietly anymore. Not off the record. What had been hidden in documents and late-night work was now being handled in the open, with people who didn't answer to the HOA or anyone connected to it. And just like that, the entire structure of control they had built collapsed. Not slowly. Not over time, but all at once. Right there in front of everyone. The changes didn't happen overnight, but for the first time since all of this started, they moved in the right direction. Within days, official notices replaced the ones the HOA had been sending me for weeks, not threats this time, orders. The drainage system was flagged for immediate removal, and crews came back, not to build, but to undo what had been forced into place. The trench was broken apart section by section, the concrete pulled out, the flow redirected back to where it should have been all along. It wasn't perfect right away. The land had taken damage, and it would take time to fully recover, but the direction had changed. It was mine again. The HOA board didn't survive it. Investigations followed quickly, and the same structure they used to pressure everyone else collapsed under real scrutiny. Documents were reviewed. Decisions questioned. Authority stripped back piece by piece until there was nothing left to hide behind. Daniel disappeared from the meetings first. Then his name came up in reports. Then officially removed. Not quietly either. There were charges. Real ones. The kind you don't walk away from with a statement or an excuse. After that, the neighborhood slowly started to shift. People who hadn't spoken to me in weeks began to reappear. Some approached carefully, like they weren't sure how I'd respond. A few apologized outright, admitting they knew something wasn't right but didn't want to get involved. Others didn't say anything at all. Just nodded when they passed by, like that was enough to acknowledge what had happened. I didn't push any of them. Everyone had made their own choices when it mattered. Now they were living with them. The silence that had once felt heavy started to change too. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was normal again. Conversations returned. Movement felt natural. The tension that had been sitting under everything finally lifted, replaced by something steadier. As for me, I didn't celebrate. There was no moment where it felt like a victory worth marking. No big reaction. No sense of triumph. I just walked the edge of my land one evening, the same way I used to before any of this started, and stopped where the trench had been. The ground was still uneven in places, still healing, but it was quiet. No machines, no forced movement of water. No one standing there pretending they had a right to it. Just mine. The way it was supposed to be. And standing there, I understood something that I hadn't fully seen at the beginning. People like Daniel don't always take what they want by force. They don't show up and demand it outright. They build pressure. They use paperwork. They rely on silence, on people choosing not to get involved, not to question, not to push back. That's how they take control. Piece by piece, until it feels like it was always theirs. And the only way to stop it isn't by waiting or hoping it resolves itself. It's by standing there, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when you're the only one doing it, and refusing to give ground. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?